a particular policy. For example, an economic policies about free trade might impact different groups differently, but generally they're all impacted in any way, whether it benefits them or it harms them. Given the fact and given the circumstances that all people are equally impacted, then the rationale that should be all people should have an equal rights to vote and participate in democracy. Second justification point in this context is that their policy discriminates people based on inherent or inevitable characteristic of human being. In the past, we fight for women rights to vote, POC rights to vote, or African American rights to vote, because we understand their exclusion was discriminatory and selective in a way that it overlooks the inherent characteristic that cannot be changed, like your skin color, your identities, your ethnicities. It is something that is inevitable and you have no control over changing. That's why we vote, so that you can vote irrespective of your inherent or inevitable characteristic. This is similar to age, because you have no control over aging, Madam Speaker. It is inevitable that one day you will age, and as you grow older, you will generally age. And it's never fine to apply their policy because it's discriminatory based on something that people have no control over, and that's something that democracy should not uphold to begin with. But number three, and most importantly, exactly, we think that if anything, old people is actually the one that needs votes the most, because as they age, people don't really invest in them, right? Companies don't really take care of these individuals. More often than not, they are already pensioned, for example. They're no longer productive. The state doesn't invest in them too, because they're not sexy in terms of investment, especially in a context where the government is too biased for millennials people, where government like excessively use the terms of millennials or younger generation, whereby they use the terms is too excessive and too massive, which indicates ages in our system. That's why we argue to you, if anything, even though we have to apply 1%, one vote, 1% policies, the older generation are actually the one that needs this voting mechanism, if anything. So that to concludes that the policy imposed by government team is unjust. Second argument, why their policy would then be harmful. The first thing to say in this context is the immediate harms upon their policy. It is the antagonization of older people, which creates another infighting or clash between ages, right? This is likely because you attack the very foundation of individuals, which is the very core rights of individuals, which is to participate in democracy. The likely scenarios that will exist in government are two. Either one, they will probably lobby politicians, make whatever it is in their favor, or number two, they participate through other means if you don't allow them through voting, like riots, creating chaos, violence, which are the things that are extremely, we don't want to create chaos or unnecessary damages in democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, want it or not, it is inevitable for people to age. It is unfair for you to impose such a high expectation for individuals not to age at all, because people still want to participate in politics. And for the equal rights of individuals, vote for opening opposition.
Thank you for this speech. Now I call upon Deputy Prime Minister here.
Check, I'm audible.
Yes, sir.
My general pronouns is he or him. If you have any POI, please type on the chat. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. We do agree that as a old generation, you also have a right, and we need to also care about you. That's why under our side of the house, we are not basically suddenly banning your right to vote, but your value of vote will be less significant in order to determine the politician itself comparatively to young generation itself. That means that basically you are still the basis of voters, politicians, but at the end of the day, you are basically become the second priority of them. And we will prove why that's something that okay for status quo. But before that, I'm going to characterize and extend more about why all generations, it shouldn't be rule our country. Opposition argue that basically it's not true, that basically the one that cares about religions, moral concept is only old generation, but also young generation. Yes, but who the measure is old generation, ladies and gentlemen? Because let me tell you, in the past, most of the time, our information is based, for example, Indonesia is based on a moral concept and religion concept that make us basically have a strong belief on the idea of moral should be like this, shouldn't be like this, and so on. Like, by the end, old generation that basically major people, let's say in Indonesia, Islamic people, will become the main actor that controlling every single things and basically try to banning every single things, not government at the end of the day. Why? Because at the end of the day, for example, if government have an idea to legalize LGBT, for example, or open free trade with China, for example, with all of that, their stereotype, they will try to, for example, limit the possibility of this agenda to comes in, ladies and gentlemen. That's the reasons why a lot of, for example, rejecting of black tourism access in Indonesia, right? The rejection, for example, the idea of LGBT, the automations of robotic, for example, in order to improving our country in social, also in economic, are get rejected. Because why? Because they basically believe in all concept that we need to work based on humans, that the concept of gender, for example, is only man and woman itself. We don't think this is good, right? Because at the end of the day, in modern era, we need to think a lot about, all people have a right to vote and so on, right? All people have a right to marry and so on. And also we need to giving a room to progression in terms of robotic and so on in order to improving our country. Under the set of the house, the moment when all people become the base of voters, all people able to control everything, the progression about LGBT rights, for example, or the progression, for example, about feminism and so on, will never access because under the set of the house, people would be only cares about the moral under the set. But even if there are a good old generations that cares about feminism, LGBT, of robotic automations, the number is a very, very small, and their, the age is no longer productive. So the way for them to contribute in order to make those kind of policy implement is also small, ladies and gentlemen. What we need to do is basically right now, it's change the pattern to young generation itself, to prepare them for that, ladies and gentlemen. Because the second problem that you need to understand, most of the time that young generation right now try to rely on the old people itself, or there are a stigma also that creating by all generations that you as a young generation not deserve enough, you are not capable enough. That's the reasons why most of the time your parents able to teach you about who the politician that you need to follow or the politician that you need to vote, right? That's the reasons why the mature of young generation will not be prepared under their side of the house, because people believe on the stigma that old generation is the best actor to determine who the politician that should be elected, even for the young generation voters itself. Let's put the comparative on our side of the house. When we basically creating narrative first, that basically you as a young generation is the one that basically handle and have bigger responsible, because your vote matters more. At the end of the day, the concern would be more to young generation itself. They will feel more burden towards that, and the awareness would be significantly good. Moreover, the rising up persons, that activism that coming from young generation in many countries also able to educate them and for example raising the awareness itself. By the end of the day, the policy will be most likely goes to young generation itself. Before I go, yes, CEO.
If the narrative actually exists, then this is not the problem about whether or not you are going to reduce the votes of the older generation. It's the problem of those young people to actually proliferate and to search for other forms of information to have an informed consent.
Yes, the informations would be matters if at the end of the day you have a capability to giving more contribution by your vote itself, right? We do not say that we just only giving, for example, you have a matter vote, but we don't give them an information education. Education in car status quo will also be given, but at the end of the day, they will matters the moment when you have a vote, right? Let's talk about why under our set of the house would be more beneficial. Look, as a young generation, they're concerned most likely about how to, giving more right to women, for example, because they're already more progressive, right? Second of all, like giving a lot of people to have a more free trade, for example, and also robotic automation. Why this is basically beneficial? First, in terms of social, we think that everyone have a right, and every debater in here must be agree about that, right? That's the reasons why if you want, for example, legalize LGBT group or giving more rights towards women, you need to focus about young generation itself. Number one, they're concerned about that. But second of all, even if not, they're easily, for example, to influence or educate first, because they do not have, for example, the fixed mindset they do not want to change, like what of people that already have really strong belief and they do not want to change at the very first place, ladies and gentlemen. But that's why even under our side of the house, at worst, the young generation itself do not ready enough, but the probability to teach them and educate them, it's better, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, in terms of, for example, all people, like opposition saying, how about they would be left behind by the politician and so on. We say, first of all, not. They're not would be left behind, but because also the young generation itself, they do concern about old generation, about their own parents, right? That's the reason they would not left behind. But second of all, they also still a basis of voters. Their voice also matters, even less significant. Therefore, they're always, like a politician try as well to shaping the agenda to give them a better life. But third of all, even if at the worst they were left behind, we say that it's okay. Because they already, for example, have feeling a good life or a good way of democracies by their own vote for so long time, right? Under our side of the house, young generation will not blame old generation in the futures because at the end of the day, they are who determine. In current status quo, they will most likely blame the old generations because the one that basically determine current policy is old generation were very, very proud to propose.
Okay, thank you so much for your speech. Our call upon Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Check. Am I audible? Just kidding.
Yes.
Right. Cool. Right. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'll start my speech by telling you about the technical aspects of this round. I would admit that this motion is a bit more challenging for GovBench. The idealist versus realist sort of motion, right? The contention between that. But ask yourself this question and take a look at your notes. Did they, in any way, shape, or form, attempt to explain the inherent features of age and ageism, not the religion, not the awareness of politics, which I think is quite clearly circumstantial and not inherent, but the inherent features of age? I don't think they did. Or did they, for instance, talk about the purpose of democracy? I don't think they did. Having that said, I think there are 2 questions that are very important in this round. 1, is democracy's purpose to make good policy? And let's define good policy. Secondly, what will be the generational dynamics, intergenerational dynamics, and the outcome towards democracy? Let's start with the first one. First of all, let me challenge you to GovBench. Can you define good policy? Tell me why liberalism is superior compared to conservatism. Tell me when the outlook of conservatism is different across time, when religiosity of people is different across time, or even when people's choice is different across time, across generation. Why would that be something bad? I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's something bad. Let me tell you a quote from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I just love to do this, by the way, political philosophy. In democracy, each of us give up our power to the supreme direction of general will. General will is our social, political will. And we accept that each member, each of us, is an indivisible part of the whole. That's the reason why we are mentioned as one country. We have the same identity, for example, to a certain extent. And there is this notion of imagined community, that we're looking and pursuing the same goals. The problem with the case from opening government is that they attach your worth, your self-worth, your political worth to your age. Now, is this suitable? What is the inherent features of age? You're just older. You just live longer. That's it. Maybe, arguably, you can die faster, but it's not inherent. It's fate. It depends on individual basis. Maybe though, but why is dying faster supposed to mean that you don't vote as much, or you don't have as much power in your voting rights and in your political rights? You are not being listened to as much as the younger people. If your problem, let me define a good democracy then, if you can't. A good democracy is when you listen to the will of the people, and a bad one is when there's a corruptive features in it. Now, is conservatism a corruptive features in democracy? Well, if people want it, then so be it. Let people decide what's good and bad for them. If there's money in politics, if that's corruption, if there's corruption, then the politicians are unlikely to listen to the will of the people, to the general will, like what Russo said. That's when democracy becomes bad. That's when you listen to the general will, and that becomes harmful to the control of democracy that you have at the end. So that is the inherent features that's that. If you disagree with money in politics, of course, I disagree with that. Cut that off. If you disagree with corruption, punish the corruptors. That's how you make a good democracy. Now, I would disagree generally with the stereotype analysis of youth versus older generations that they mentioned, but for this, because I think the youth are just as diverse, if not more, than the older generation. Then if it's very diverse, why bother like discriminating based on age? Something that's a characteristics you can't choose. But let's just be extremely generous with them. Let's assume that all the youth are liberals. All of them are tech bros from Silicon Valley, for example. Let's assess, but that's still bad. I think what maybe differentiates youth and older generation in the stereotyped work of opening government is that more likely than not, the youth is going to be very hasty and do not have the understanding because they don't live as long. They don't have the wisdom to understand that oftentimes the pendulum of politics go back and forth, go revert back to its past, etc. Because they're more likely in that case in the stereotype work to be more emotional, to be have less patience towards political and politics in general. What would happen? Let's just talk about a certain policy, like to make this concrete, not like, oh, you're more aware. I don't care. That's so vague. Let's take a look at renewable energy, say, for example, something I've done research on. Fossil fuel is much cheaper than geothermal, which have to be geospatially appropriate in a certain region only, or solar panel, which is harder to be planted in some instances, and the battery needs to be changed. So it's much more expensive. But people have this incentive to just ship. What's the difficulty? Well, the difficulty is you're going to raise and jack prices up, and this is the impact of democracy. 3 times or even 5 times more than what we have today. Industrialization is going to be harmed. People are going to pay a lot more. Inflation is going to be skyrocketing, etc. That's a problem. But you don't have the patience oftentimes because these youth, these tech bros, are so privileged. More often than not, they don't live in a rural area. They don't communicate with their neighbors. They don't have the collective will, the general will that we're talking about as democracy. Maybe water is cheaper. Yeah. Water is cheaper, but you need stable current in water, stable current water, and you also need a much larger areas as opposed to like fossil fuel, meaning it's not effective in most cases. So this impatience is going to be dangerous. Moreover, I think the pandering to youth is going to be more dangerous because you're going to pander to these impatient people when sometimes democracy requires coalition, concession, getting policies done, which can be done at the point when you're not patient. You don't do policy assessment in general. This is incredibly dangerous to democracy as well. What happens also is you're going to have a generational you're perpetuating generational war or intergenerational war because you change the tone, the entire dynamics between generation, and you create this sort of notion that there is generational hegemony that can be questioned. Insofar as you're youth, insofar as you're younger, then you're more politically aware, then you're more savvy, then you're smarter. I think that's crazy. That creates a harmful political dynamics. This is not in line, ladies and gentlemen, with the purpose of democracy, of creating good policy, and this perpetuates generational war. For that reason, we oppose.
Thank you for your speech. I call upon member of government to hear.
To do POI, please just write it in the chat box because I'm going to be standby on my chat box. So I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. At best, what closing government is doing is only respond to opening opposition without caring about their argumentation. Because I think that all of the centralization of their argumentation is derivative from the opening government, talking about on how, for example, the contributions of these old people, for instance. So that is the reason why they should not be the subject of our constituent in the politics and so on and so forth, right? But when CJ told you, ladies and gentlemen, so yeah, I think that with that being said, they are only responding to opening opposition, but even if and the response might not necessarily be clear as well, right? So I think that this is going to be an opposition batch debate. So let's engage to the closing of government contributions in this debate, right? Closing government told you that this is actually not fair. The idea of democracy being one head, one voice, for example, because older people, for example, have more voices in the parliament and so on and so forth, right? So I don't necessarily think that why this is not fair. I do not know why this is unfair under their side of the house, because the fact that they have seats in the parliament, it means that they also have the popularity within the people, right? They are also elected by these people in the very first place. Because I think that the idea of making policy is not only you talking about, okay, I want a progressive policy, but you also need to be able to be wise and considering about a lot of facts that might impact it, a lot of sectors when your policy is being implemented, right? And I think that this is an inherent nature that maybe young people do not necessarily have, right? We are not necessarily saying that older people are good in making policy, but in closing opposition, what we're going to prove to you is that the idea of counterbalance in centralization of making the policy is going to be better under our side of the house. They talk about accountability, ladies and gentlemen. We say that no, this is not true. Accountability does not have to come from weight age, right? Because whether or not you implement or not implementing this proposal, I think that the idea of populations to always ask accountability from their incoming government always exists, regardless whether or not you need to be able to prove to this, right? The precedent is that younger people, even without this proposal, will still ask for accountability, right? Regardless this proposal is going to be passed or not, because some policy might affect them, such as the student loans, for example, right? So I think that this is something that I think is not exclusive under their side of the house. So moving on to my contribution. So first of all, let's distinct from opening opposition, right? We admit it's true what Atfikra said. It's challenging for the government teams to talk about this motion. But you know what is more challenging? Becomes Shagung and Atfikra closing.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk about this, right? Oo talks beautifully about this is something that they cannot control. But what we're going to do in closing opposition is that I will be talking about why the incapabilities of senior citizens to contribute and be productive in the civilization is caused by the government failure, right? Their incapabilities and to be able to contribute is caused by the government failure. So what are we saying? Maybe it's true that the reason why old people are no longer productive at all is because OO said that their age is too old to be productive. But maybe there are other reasons. There is more variable to you educators, right? That is how the government deliberately excludes senior citizens, thus decreasing their votes, for example, because of they are less contributive is not justified, right? So I'm going to talk about why the government has deliberately designed our states to exclude the senior citizen, and why because of this their vote should not be deliberately be decreased, right? One easy concept that you need to understand is the concept of reward and punishment in democratic country. We think that having the power of your votes are forms of punishment that elder people do not deserve. Two things. Number one, in democratic country, the only subject that deserve punishment is the people who have severely violated our law and constitution. This is why we do not give the serial killer right to vote, for example. This is why we do not give terrorists the right to vote, right? That's because we want them to be punished because they have disgraced our democracy. They have been able to challenge our absolute national law. Thus, in order to maintain our legitimacy and pride of state, you need to show off power that state is able to control your behavior, right? That state is not going to stay silent whenever you disgrace our nation. This is how order is going to be created under our side of the house, right? This is the very momentum for you to justify your punishment to be applied in the very first place, right? But second, these old people do not do this. Sometimes they are not able to contribute is not because of they have inherent intention for being less contributive because of something that they cannot control, such as aging, like what Shagun said, because we say that some senior citizens has been habituated with work, for example, and sometimes they still want to work. There are many examples, like for example, my grandpa, right? But sometimes they become irrelevant in the modernization, not because of themselves, but because of your automation that you install in your country, for instance, that you install in this high industrialization, and at the same time, you are not giving them enough socialization and adaptation program, for example, with this fast pace of modernization or fast pace of modern advanced development, right? Making them unable to, for example, to participate, right? We think that under the years of the house, it is going to be bad. Because if you, for example, highly contingent the idea of contribution coming from the people who are productive, for example, who have progressive mindset, for example, we said that this is not a right thing to do, right? Simply because sometimes they are becoming irrelevant, for example, simply because you do not include them. There is not enough socialization, for example, for them to adapt with automation that you do in this modern industrialization and so on and so forth, right? What does this bring to you? Sometimes what they do is not within their fault, but this is because of the government failures to be able to be more inclusive towards these senior citizens. Thus, their justification cannot fall in decreasing the votes of these senior citizens. But number two, let's talk about counterbalance and transitional political process, right? Look, the civilization that young people and old people live is different. Therefore, their mindset might relatively be different, right? This is the reason why, for example, the centralization of the policy might also be different, right? Youths, ladies and gentlemen, are always focused on instant gratification on what they think to be happier for them, for example. They enjoy the fast fashion industry, right? Because they can post on their Instagram using nice clothing and so on and so forth, and yada, 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 right? What does this mean to you? This means, for example, they will be having a policy that most likely not controlling the idea of this fast fashion industry and so on and so forth. Different with old people, for example, that most likely focusing about the idea of welfare and environmental policy, because of environment is highly contingent on their comfortability of living, for example. So I think that if youths are only focusing on instant gratification, I think that the check and balance will not exist under their side of the house, because the policy that they are trying to champion is the policy that might not necessarily be necessarily have been properly assessed, for example, to be implemented and so on and so forth, right? Under our side of the house, when the votes are the youth and the votes of the old people is able to be done, we think that what happened is that there will be an idea of counter and balance of which policy is wise to be implemented in this democratic country that is inclusive for all people, very proud to stand on closing opposition.
Okay, thank you so much for please not to wrap up the government's case and call upon government with here.
Am I audible?
Idea of counterbalance, in which that most of these young generations have a perception that the world is so ideal and have a tendencies to opt in towards instant gratification. This is the role of these old people at the end of the day, right? Those that are living under the age of 50 or 60, because they are able to counterbalance that. They're able to ensure a proper discussions of policy can be made to begin with, right? They can ensure that those kind of world are not going to be as destructive as what the young populations are going to do, right? This is the things that exist within our house. But second, Karen also told you on the idea of transitional politics, right? In which that these older people are able to aid those newer generations or new incumbent government to actually transition from one government to another government, never been engaged, keep closing government. But I'm going to be extremely charitable, right? Pretty much, they brought one exclusive point in regards of the accountability, and second, pretty much about the idea of whether or not those older people possess power, right? Which I'm going to integrate back, of course, when I'm going to frame out OG. But first, let's engage their independent things on the idea of better accountability. Look, I think one clarification is necessary to take the entire government cases is that these motions is not talking about only those young people under the age of 18 until 25, but also and those that are living under 60 and above. But we're also talking about those people that are middle aged or that are living under the age of 50 or 40 and so on and so forth, right? Meaning the one impacted by this policy is not only the one who are in pension or retired. This darkly neutralize their points on accountability, saying that people do not have time, right? Look, middle-aged people still can live for another 30 years. Why justify this? But second, let's flip their entire logic. Young people, in fact, are going to be much occupied within their life, right? Look, the world is not as easy towards the newer generations in comparison with the older generation. It is even harder for them to secure a job and to climb the corporate ladders. In fact, they are pushed to exert twice as much efforts. They need to prove themselves better than those older generation. They are paid minimum wages and expect to be working from 9 to 5 at the end of the day. So many things to do, and they do not have enough time, right? Comparatively, those older people have bigger time. If time is their biggest matters under the world of closing government, right? Because those people already sit on managerial position or executive position that allows you to have bigger free times, bigger vacations. This allows them to actually think about the politics at the end of the day, right? In fact, they also cares about competition as of now. That is why they also care. Let's take the closing government. But then let's engage with the government idea on the clashes on whether or not these older people are actually that powerful, right? Look, old generations, they told you that old generations will hamper young generation voices to be heard. They can only win this clash if they can explain to you that without any of these policies, young people are going to be so powerless. If I can prove to you two things, that number one, young generations remain powerful, and second, those older generations, irrespective of those young generations, are still more vulnerable, we win and we take this debate, we pursue. But second, let's engage on the idea of whether or not they are truly powerful, right? I think the government never contextualized how the current political fields actually look like. Politics live in spectrums. Exist several politicians who cater to those who are conservative. We call those as right-wing. Exist as well those that are catering to the idea of young generation who are generally progressive, those of liberal. This mitigates many of the government harms. But even if, let's take them and be charitable, whether the older generations are truly that powerful in influencing the young generation. But previously, it means that those young generations still can participate in politics because the politicians still want to cater to them because they are the constituents, right? But even if whether or not the older generations are truly that powerful. Number one, this is not likely. Three things. Number one, we are living within a globalized world where the world is integrated. It is so easy for you to discuss with people, sharing perspective on your ideologies on the internet. Second, youth are going to interact with many people besides their parents in school, university, and even extracurricular activities. Access diverse ideologies within people. Third, youth are more likely to unionize with other youth because the idea of relatability. In many youth circles, progressiveness are seen as cool and friendly. This is why they prefer this instead of conservative agenda. But even if the older generations are truly that powerful in terms of house, there's no comparative in the world at all. Even if you lessen the weight of the older people's values, if the power of those older generations are that strong on how they contact us to you and influencing the new generations, why this will change, right? If they told you that young generations feel that they're not able to express their voices, if they truly care about the politics, they're going to vote it regardless. They're not going to be disillusioned by this idea that I cannot change anything. Kick OG and closing government as well. But now, let's engage and let's explain whether or not those older people actually are fully in the current status quo, right? No. Sure.
You told us recently that younger generations are too busy because they have higher expectations, but at the same time, you told us that, oh, they have power. We're kind of confused.
Yeah, they still have power. It does not negate that. But I think that even if, for example, they are going to do and they're going to commit a lot of work at the end of the day, if they truly care about the politics, they will still be able to invest time on it, right? I do not necessarily wise that part of the relevant, right? But second, let's engage on whether or not those older generations are truly that vulnerable. Look, the opening opposition never explained to you why powers are concentrated within old generation, especially within the context that older generation populations are decreasing because of old age disease, COVID-19, and so on and so forth. Whereas in the comparative, young people populations are increasing. People are horny, having sex, not taking birth control, and then exists narrative that more children the better, and so on and so forth, right? CG actually agrees to that these older generations are starting to decrease. Or never explained to you the vulnerability status of those older generation. At best, they only explain to you that old people need help the most, but they never explain to you where their condition will be much worse than off in their summer house. This is what closing government provides to you. The actual context of old generations within the status quo. Their votes are decreasing, but in the world of government, it's going to be even smaller. This is the burden of thin government to explain why any affirmative policies towards these generations will remain meaningful without being symbolic. Government told you they're okay with sacrificing older generation, and so on and so forth, right? My question would be, would you let someone that allows you to grow, that assists you throughout your entire life, that's always there for you, would you allow and let your parents to be sacrificed, left attended without being properly cared for? You as a human possess emotion and rationale. I do not think that it is actually human for you to sacrifice them. These are the reasons why we also win within this debate. These are the reasons and this is what the closing option provides you. We provide you why these particular motions are going to bring significant harms towards the idea of the older people. We explain to you the vulnerability of it. We explain to you on the macro scale we are perceived.
Okay, thank you so much for the debate, everyone. Please cross bench and shake hands and whatever, and use the breakout room. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Take care, everyone.